In the kingdom of Oakhaven, silence was once a luxury, but for Lyra, it was about to become her only shield. The night her family fell was the coldest in 100 years. The snow didn't fall white. It looked crimson under the flickering light of the burning ancestral estate. Lyra stood in the hidden cellar, the scent of smoke and old parchment filling her lungs. Her father, the great general, had placed a small jade vial in her hand. "They are coming for the bloodline, Lyra," he had whispered, his voice steady even as the heavy boots of the king's guard thundered above them. "To survive, you must become a shadow. You must see everything and say nothing." As the bitter liquid coated her throat, Lyra felt a searing heat followed by a terrifying, absolute numbness. She tried to scream as the guards broke through the door, but only a soft, hollow breath escaped her lips. She was no longer the general's daughter. She was a ghost. 2 years later, the ghost lived in the kitchens of the imperial palace. Lyra, now known only as Number 42, scrubbed the soot-stained floors of the great hall. To the other servants, she was the mute mouse. They pushed her, stole her rations, and whispered their darkest secrets in front of her, thinking a girl without a tongue was as safe as a stone wall. But Lyra was listening. She was mapping the guards' rotations. She was memorizing the seals on the minister's letters. And most importantly, she was watching the high balcony of the North Pavilion, the place where the cursed prince was kept in golden chains. They said Prince Kaelin had been touched by a demon. They said his face was so hideous that the sun refused to shine on it. But as Lyra looked up that evening, she saw a man standing at the edge of the stone railing. The wind caught his dark hair, and for a split second, the moonlight hit the silver mask on his face. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man waiting for a blade to end his boredom. Little did he know, the girl with the amber eyes and the silent tongue was about to give him a reason to fight back. In the palace, being sent to the North Pavilion was considered a death sentence. It was a crumbling, beautiful prison of white jade and black wood, surrounded by a forest of bamboo that hissed in the wind. Because of the curse, no servant stayed for more than a week. Some claimed they went mad from the isolation. Others whispered that the prince's silver mask hid a face that turned men to stone. Lady Mara, the king's favorite concubine, stood in the courtyard, her crimson silks snapping in the breeze. She looked at the line of shivering servants, her eyes landing on the one girl who didn't look down, the mute girl with the amber eyes. "You," Mara said, pointing a gold-clad finger at Lyra. "You will be the prince's primary attendant. You will clean his rooms, bring his meals, and tend to his incense. And since you cannot speak, you cannot spread the filth he utters. Do you understand?" Lyra bowed low, her face a mask of perfect submission. Inside, her mind was a whirlwind. This was it. The North Pavilion was the heart of the palace's secrets. The air inside the pavilion was thick. Too thick. It smelled of heavy jasmine and a strange metallic undertone that made Lyra's head spin. She walked through the dim corridors until she reached the central chamber. There, sitting at a low table covered in ancient scrolls, was Prince Kaelin. He didn't look up. The silver mask on the left side of his face caught the dying sunlight, casting a jagged shadow across the wall. Kaelin's hand, long and elegant but trembling slightly, reached for a cup. He paused, his silver-gray eyes flicking toward Lyra. "Another one," he rasped. His voice was like dry leaves scraping on stone, unused and bitter. "Did they tell you I eat the hearts of servants, or did they just promise your family a bag of gold if you survived the month?" Lyra didn't flinch. She stepped forward, picked up the teapot, and began to pour. Her movements were precise, a dance of shadows. She didn't look at his mask, she looked at his hands. As she poured the tea, she noticed the incense burner on his desk. A thick purple smoke coiled out of it. Lyra's nostrils flared. She recognized that scent. It wasn't jasmine, it was nightstock, a rare root that causes hallucinations and eventual heart failure if inhaled for too long. He wasn't cursed, he was being methodically erased. Kaelin watched her, his gaze intense. "You don't tremble," he noted, a hint of curiosity breaking through his cold shell. Tell me, girl, are you brave or are you just too stupid to be afraid? Lyra met his silver gray eyes. She reached out slowly, an act of extreme defiance, and pointed to the incense burner, then made a sharp, cutting motion across her throat. Kaelin froze. The curiosity in his eyes turned to sharp suspicion. The incense? It is a gift from the king to soothe my condition. Lyra shook her head vigorously. She took a small calligraphy brush from his desk and on a scrap of discarded paper drew a single elegant symbol, poison. Kaelin stared at the paper. Then he looked at the mute servant in her rough brown robes. For the first time in 5 years, the cursed prince felt a flicker of something other than despair. "Who are you?" he whispered. Lyra took the paper back, crumpled it into a ball, and swallowed it. She picked up her broom and began to sweep, leaving the prince standing in the purple smoke of his own slow death. Trust in the palace was a luxury that cost lives. Prince Kaelin knew this better than anyone. He had spent years accepting his slow decline, believing his curse was a punishment from the gods. But the mute girl with the amber eyes had planted a seed of doubt that was now blooming into a quiet rebellion. For 3 days, Lyra did not speak. She did not write another word. Instead, she cleaned. She scrubbed the floors, but her movements followed the patterns of a military phalanx. She arranged the prince's library, but she placed the books in an order that, when read by the first letter of each spine, spelled out, "Watch the walls." Kaelin sat at his desk, his eyes following Lyra as she dusted a shelf of ancient history scrolls. He was no longer the slumped, defeated man she had met. He sat straighter. He watched her every move with the intensity of a predator who had just rediscovered his claws. "You aren't a servant," he said softly, his voice regaining a bit of its former steel. "I've watched your hands. You don't hold a broom like a peasant. You hold it like a spear. Your calluses are in the wrong places for a maid." Lyra didn't look back. She reached for a bowl of fruit on the table. She took a knife and with a flick of her wrist that was far too fast for a commoner, carved an apple into the shape of a lotus, the symbol of the high command. Kaelin's breath hitched. "That is the general's mark, my father's most trusted commander. He was executed for treason. His entire family was wiped out." Lyra turned then. She didn't bow. She walked to the window and pointed out toward the western mountains where the Great Wall stood, the wall her father had defended for 30 years. She then pointed to her own eyes, then to the prince's heart. "I see the truth. Do you?" The door to the pavilion swung open. Lady Mara entered, her red silks hissing against the stone like a snake. She was accompanied by 2 guards, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. "My prince," Mara purred, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of change. "Has the new servant been entertaining you?" Kaelin slumped back into his chair, the cursed mask hiding his true expression. He forced a cough, making his voice sound weak and rasping. "She is a stone, Lady Mara, useful for cleaning, but quite boring. I prefer the silence to the sobbing of the others." Mara walked over to Lyra, her heavy gold rings glinting. She used the tip of her jade fan to lift Lyra's chin. "A mute bird is a safe bird, but even a mute bird can be taught to fly away if it sees too much." Mara leaned in, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. "I hear you spend a lot of time near the incense, little mouse. Be careful. Too much fragrance can make a girl lose her mind or her life." When the door clicked shut, Kaelin stood up. He walked to the incense burner and with a sudden burst of strength threw the lid across the room. He looked at Lyra, his silver gray eyes burning with a new dangerous light. "They think I am a dying flame," Kaelin hissed. "Teach me, number 42. Teach me the strategies of the general. Show me how a ghost wins a war." Lyra stepped toward the dust-covered floor. Using the damp rag she had been scrubbing with, she began to draw. She didn't draw flowers or symbols. She drew a map of the palace's hidden sewer lines and the guards' blind spots. The mute mouse was no longer just a servant. She was the prince's general. The Lotus Festival was the one night a year when the palace gates were thrown open to the nobility. The sky above Oakhaven was a canvas of exploding gold and red. But inside the forbidden pavilion, the air tasted of copper and ash. Lyra stood by the window, her amber eyes scanning the rooftops. She didn't need a voice to know the coup had started. She had seen the signal, a single white lantern rising from the East Barracks. Her father's old division was being slaughtered, and the Kingsguard had been replaced by Lady Mara's personal mercenaries. Prince Kaelin emerged from his bedchamber, his dark hair disheveled, his hand white-knuckled around a rusted practice sword. "They're here," he said, the silver mask gleaming in the firelight. "Mara isn't waiting for the poison anymore. She wants the throne tonight." Lyra didn't panic. She walked to the large stone hearth in the center of the room. She reached into the soot and pulled a hidden lever. The back of the fireplace swung open, revealing a narrow, damp tunnel that smelled of ancient earth. "The sewer lines," Kaelin whispered, looking at Lyra in shock. "How did you find this?" Lyra didn't answer. She grabbed a torch, lit it from the dying embers of the fire, and gestured for him to follow. As they stepped into the dark, the main doors of the pavilion were kicked open. The tunnels were a labyrinth designed to confuse assassins, but Lyra moved through them with the certainty of a ghost. She knew every turn, every trap, and every loose stone. Behind them, the sounds of the palace burning echoed through the vents. Suddenly, Lyra stopped. She held up a hand, her ears straining. At the end of the tunnel, lit by a dozen lanterns, stood Lady Mara. She wasn't alone. 6 mercenaries stood with her, their blades drawn and coated in a dark, viscous liquid. "Did you really think the mute mouse was the only one who knew the palace's secrets?" Mara laughed, the sound cold and sharp. "I let her lead you here, Kaelin. It's much easier to dispose of a prince in a sewer than in a bedroom. No one will ever find the bodies." Kaelin stepped in front of Lyra, raising his rusted sword. "You'll have to kill me first, Mara." "That," Mara smirked, "is the plan." The mercenaries lunged. Kaelin fought with the desperation of a cornered wolf, but he was weakened by years of poison. He parried one blow, then another, but a third blade sliced across his shoulder. He fell to one knee, the silver mask slipping slightly. Mara stepped forward with a dagger raised high. "Goodbye, little prince." The dagger flew from Mara's hand as a steel needle buried itself in her wrist. Mara screamed, clutching her arm. The mercenaries froze. They looked at the mute servant. Lyra was no longer bowing. She stood tall, her amber eyes burning with a cold, ancestral fury. She reached into the folds of her rough brown robes and pulled out a pair of short, curved daggers, the signature weapons of the general's elite guard. For the first time in 2 years, Lyra opened her mouth. Her voice was raspy, unused, and terrifyingly calm. "Step away from the prince," she said. The guards hesitated, terrified by the sudden transformation. "You can speak!" Mara shrieked, her face contorted in rage. "Kill her! Kill her now!" Lyra didn't wait. She moved like a blur of brown linen and flashing steel. She didn't fight like a maid. She fought like a storm. In the narrow tunnel, the mercenaries' long swords were a disadvantage. Lyra danced between them, her daggers finding the gaps in their armor with surgical precision. In less than a minute, the 6 men lay silent. Lyra stood over them, her chest heaving, a single streak of blood across her cheek. She turned her gaze to Mara, who was backed against the damp wall, trembling. "My father was a general, and I am his daughter. You killed my family for a throne you will never sit on." Lyra raised her dagger, but a hand caught her wrist. It was Kaelin. He was bleeding, his face pale, but his silver-gray eyes were clear. "No," he whispered. "Don't stain your soul for her. We need her alive to tell the king the truth." Lyra looked at the prince, then at the woman who had destroyed her life. Slowly, she lowered the blade. She looked at Kaelin, and for the first time, she let the mask of the servant drop. "We have to go," she said. "The western gate is the only way out." The secret passage ended at the base of the western wall, the jagged stone spine of the kingdom. Above them, the stars were disappearing behind thick plumes of smoke rising from the capital. Lyra dragged Prince Kaelin into the cold mountain air. His wound was deep, and the cold was turning his breath into white mist. They were miles from the palace, but they were not alone. Shadows moved among the rocks. "Halt!" a voice boomed from the darkness. "The western gate is closed by order of the king. Identify yourselves or die where you stand." Kaelin tried to stand, but he stumbled. Lyra caught him, bracing his weight against her shoulder. She stepped forward into the moonlight, letting the wind pull the leather cord from her hair. Her long black hair billowed around her like a war banner. "I am Lyra of House Valerius," she shouted, her voice ringing out with the authority of the general who had raised her. "Daughter of the man who built this wall, I carry the jade seal, and I bring you the true king of Oakhaven." A massive figure stepped forward, Commander Thorn, a man scarred by 100 battles and a loyal friend to Lyra's father. He looked at the girl he thought had died in the crimson snow. He looked at the silver-masked prince at her side. "The mute mouse," Thorn whispered, his eyes widening. He looked at her amber eyes, eyes that matched the portrait of the general hanging in the barracks. He fell to one knee, followed by the sound of 500 sets of armor hitting the ground in unison. "The Western Army is yours, Lady Lyra," Thorn declared. "Lead us." The counterattack was not a battle. It was a reckoning. Lyra did not return to the palace as a servant. She rode at the head of the cavalry, clad in her father's silver and black armor, her curved daggers glinting in the morning sun. Behind her, the cursed prince rode with his mask removed. He didn't hide his face anymore. The scar on his cheek wasn't a curse. It was a mark of survival. They broke through the palace gates at dawn. Lady Mara's mercenaries, seeing the legend of the general return to life in his daughter, threw down their weapons in terror. The final confrontation happened in the great hall. The king, frail and misled, sat on the throne, while Mara stood beside him, her face pale with desperation. Lyra walked up the center aisle, her boots echoing on the marble she used to scrub. She stopped at the foot of the throne. She didn't draw her sword. She simply held up a scroll, the decoded messages she had found in the North Pavilion, detailing Mara's plot and the source of the prince's poison. "The silence is over," Lyra said, her voice echoing to the rafters. The king looked at the evidence. He looked at his son, standing tall and strong. He looked at the daughter of the man he had wrongly executed. With a trembling hand, the king ordered the guards to take Mara away. A month later, the North Pavilion was no longer a prison. The black bamboo had been cleared, and the sun shone through the white jade windows. Kaelin stood on the balcony, looking out over a kingdom that was finally healing. He heard a soft footstep behind him. He didn't have to turn to know who it was. "The council wants to know if you will take the title of Grand Commander," Kaelin said, a smile finally reaching his silver-gray eyes. "They say the army won't follow anyone else." Lyra stood beside him, dressed in simple, elegant silk, a mix of her servant past and her noble future. She looked at the mountains she used to use as an escape. "I've spent a long time being a shadow, Kaelin. I think I'd like to see what it's like to live in the light for a while." Kaelin reached out, taking her hand. "You saved the kingdom with your silence. Now you'll lead it with your voice." As the sun set over Oakhaven, the mute servant was gone. In her place stood a legend, and for the first time in her life, the silence wasn't a shield, it was peace.